Hi and welcome to Cisca Stitches. In today's video, we're going to be making a very kind of easy jacket or blazer jacket, however we want to call it. This jacket is going to be collarless, so it's not going to have any collar, and we are not going to line it. Instead, we are going to use facing. So it's something that you can make in a day. Very simple project. So what we're going to do first is to draft the back. The back is not going to be cut in two, it's going to be closed. So I have my fabric here. First of all, I'm going to draw the shoulder line. And from this shoulder line, we are going to be marking our armhole divided by 2. So I'm going with armhole of 19 inches. 19 divided by 2 is 9.5. So I'm going to come right here, mark 9.5, and then we're going to draw a straight line across. So in order to draft the armhole, we are first going to mark our shoulder divided by 2. My shoulder is 16. 16 divided by 2 is 8. So I'm going to come right here, mark 8 inches, come down here, mark 8 inches, and draw a straight line across. Now, once this is done, all we need to do is to go on to mark the bust circumference on this line. My bust is 38. 38 divided by 4 is 9.5. So because we're making a jacket, I'm going to add an extra ½ inch to this, making that 10 inches. And then I'm going to add a ½ inch seam allowance. So we want the jacket not to be like we're making a fitted dress, just, a very simple jacket. What I'm going to do next is to come right here. I'll be marking my waist and my hip. So my waist is 17 inches. Also, we'll need to mark our bust points. I'm going with a bust point of 11 inches. I'll do the same thing here as well, so we can have a straight line. And then I'll be going with a hip of 28 inches. So I'll mark my bust point 11, mark my waist 17, and then come right here, mark my hip of 28 inches. And I'm going to go on to draw straight lines across this point. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to come right to my bust span, or my bust point. I'm going to be marking my bust span, which is nipple to nipple divided by 2, and I'm marking it from the center back right here. So mine is 8 divided by 4 is 8 divided by 2, sorry, is 4 inches. So I'm marking it across the bust point line, the waist, as well as the hip, and I'm going to draw a straight line across. So what we want to do next is to mark our darts. So I'll be marking darts of ½ inch on both sides around my waist. And then I'm going to come right at the bottom around the hip, mark 4 inches upwards. And then what I'm going to do is make my triangular darts connect here to here to here, then connect from here to here to here. So after drafting my darts, what I'm going to do next is to just come right here, mark my shoulder slope of 1 inch, okay, and then I'm going to be going with a neck width of 3.5 inches. So from the center back, I mark 3.5 inches. I'm going to join these 2 points to form my shoulder slope, and then I'm going to create my armhole curve just like this. Very simple. Now what I'm going to do next is to come to my waist, mark my waist circumference divided by 4. My waist is 33. 33 divided by 4 is 8.25. Mark my dart allowance of 1 inch. Okay, so I'm adding ½ inch extra to all horizontal measurements. So I'm going to add that ½ inch and then add my ½ inch seam allowance. Okay, then I'm going to come right at the bottom of the jacket, which is around my hip, mark my hip circumference divided by 4, and that is 10.75 already marked. Add ½ inch for the added ease, and then ½ inch for seam allowance. And what I'm going to do right now is to connect my hip to my waist, and then my waist to the bust. So I'm going to be adding a 1 inch seam allowance at the bottom. So while cutting, I'll just go on to, add that. All I need to do right now is to come right here, come to the back. We're going to be going with a 1 inch neck depth for the back. So I'm just going to come right here, mark 1 inch, and then curve out my neckline. Okay, of course, while cutting, I'll make sure to add half an inch at the neckline, half an inch at the shoulder slope, and then half an inch at the armhole. We have already added seam allowances to the rest of the pattern. It's just the bottom that we're going to add 1 inch. So after cutting the back, this is what we have. What I'm going to do next is to use the back piece to cut the front. So in order to cut the front, I place the back pattern on it, and we are going to need an extra, fabric here because of seam allowance at the center front. So this is what I'm going to do for the front. First off, I'm going to come right here and mark my neck width. What I'm going to do next is to come right here and mark the waist area. Okay, and what I'm going to do next is to come at the hip area. Now, I don't want it to go all the way straight. I want it to come inwards by, let's say, about 1.5 inch. So I'm going to measure 1.5 inch from the center back here. So we're just going to have a slight slant. So this is 1.5 inch. So let me just mark the center back on here. And then I have 1.5 inch here. So what we're basically going to do is to connect this point here to this 1.5 inch, and then connect our waist to the neck width. So just like this. And I'm going to be cutting this center front area with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That is very, very important. So I'll just go on to cut out my fabric now with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after cutting out my front pattern, I'll go on to sew the darts onto the fabric. Okay, so what I want to do right now is to cut facing for my fabric. So in order to cut the front facing, I just placed one of the front pieces on top of my fabric here, and this is what we have. Okay, so now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pin my fabric down along the center front, just a couple of places. Now what I'm going to do is to cut along the center front here so that I will follow the shape at the center front area. Then I'm going to come right here, cut the shoulder points. Okay, and then I'm going to cut the bottom of this facing fabric. So now that we have that all cut out, what I'm going to do next is to now determine how wide I want the facing to be. So I'm just going to make my facing around 4 inches. Okay, so I leave this up, I mark 4 inches. I'm going to come at the bottom. I can decide to make the bottom a lot wider, so let me just go with 6 inches. And what I'm going to do for the facing part is to just connect a straight line all the way from here to here. Now before I go on to cut this, what I'm going to do is to add about 3/4 inches after this line. That will serve as a hemming allowance for my facing. The next thing that I'm going to do is to cut the back facing. I have my piece of fabric here. Okay, it's folded into 2. I have my back pattern is folded into 2 as well. So what I'm going to do is to place the back pattern right on top of my fabric, and then I'm going to trace out the neckline. Okay, so I'll just trace out the neckline like this, and then trace out my shoulder line. Now if you remember, for the front facing shoulder line, I measured around 4 inches, and then I added 3/4 inches for a hemming allowance at the front. But I'm not going to do that for the back. I'm just going to measure out the 4 inches plus an extra 1/2 inch. So apparently I just have around 4.25 inches here. What I'm going to do after marking this out now is to now determine the length of my facing. So I'm just going to come right here mark around 3 inches. I can equally go with 3.5 or 4 inches. So I mark 3.5 here, come right here, mark 3.5, connect it like this, and then I'll go on to cut my back facing out. So after cutting out my front and back facing, this is what I have. I'm going to come at the bottom. I'm going to reduce the length by 1/2 inch, and I'm going to explain why as we go along in this tutorial. So now that I've reduced this, I'm going to now grab the facing, the front and the back. Okay, so right here is my back facing. I'm going to place right sides touching for both facings, and I'm going to go on to sew by 1/2 inch, and then I'll come right here, sew by 1/2 inch as well. Then I'm going to grab my front pieces and the back pieces, place them on top of each other with right sides touching, and then what I'm going to do is to go on to sew the shoulder seam and then sew the side seam by 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after sewing my bodice, this is what we have. I'll go on to give this a very good press, and then right here is my facing. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is to curve out the back facing. Okay, so I'm just going to fold it into two like this, and then curve it out from the shoulder area. Okay, so like this, I'm just going to curve it out. Very simple. The next thing I'm going to do is to grab the bodice piece. I'm going to make sure to overlock all the raw edges before we move on to the next stage. So the next thing I'm going to do is to place my facing on the bodice of the jacket. So I've matched the neckline of both the facing and the jacket. Before I go ahead and sew this facing, I'll have to join the bottom first, sew it by 1/2 inch. Repeat the same thing for the other side around the center front area. Sew the bottom of the facing to the bottom of the jacket by 1/2 inch. So after sewing the front facing to the jacket, what we are going to do next is to pull up the main jacket bodice by 1/2 inch. Now what we want to go ahead and do is to sew the facing to the center front around the center front area. We're going to sew by 1/2 inch from the bottom after raising this part up by 1/2 inch. Sew this place closed by 1/2 inch all the way to the shoulder area. Right here I've already sewn my back neckline, so I'll just go ahead and repeat the same thing on the other side of the jacket. Raise the bottom up by 1/2 inch and sew the center front area by 1/2 inch, joining facing to the bodice. So after sewing the facing to the jacket, I did a top stitch towards the facing, okay, so that I have the center front staying properly. I'm going to go ahead and give this a good press, but while pressing it down, I'm going to put hemming tape around that center front area so that it lays nice and flat really well. I'm also going to go ahead and put hemming tape around the edge of the facing so that it also lays nice and flat. Same thing with this part as well. I'll just fold it up a bit, put hemming tape right there. I may also go ahead and stitch around that part so that I don't have it come off whenever I'm doing laundry. So once I do that now, I'm just going to go ahead and move to the sleeves. So after pressing the jacket bodice with the hemming tape, this is what we have. You can see how the bottom looks like. Okay, nice and neat. I've not even run any stitch on the bottom at all. I already have a pattern, a tutorial on how to draft sleeves. Okay, so I'm just working with a basic sleeve. It is not being lined as well, so I've drafted my pattern. I've cut it out on fabric. I'm going to put a link to the tutorial on how to draft straight sleeves. So this is what I have. What I'm going to do next is to go on to sew the seam of the sleeve, and then we're going to go on to attach it to the jacket bodice. So after sewing my sleeves, I'm going to insert it into the armhole of the bodice. Make sure I turn it right sides out first. Of course, one thing you actually need to do is to notch the middle of your sleeve head. So after notching the center of my sleeve head, what I'm going to do next is to match it to the shoulder seam around my armhole. I make sure I place two of them on top of each other with right sides touching. Okay, so once I match them together like this, what I'm going to do next is to go on to sew the armhole together with the sleeve by a half an inch seam allowance. So that way we have attached our sleeve to the bodice. I'll repeat the same thing for my other sleeve, and then we're finally done with this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, kindly give us a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, turn on the bell so you get updates when I post new videos, and I'm going to be seeing you in my next tutorial. Bye.